When I saved my wife from cancer, I thought that was the hardest battle of my life. I sat by her hospital bed for months, holding her hand through every sleepless night, every test result, every terrifying silence that made me wonder if I'd lose her. I gave up my job, my savings, my health, everything, just to see her smile again. When the doctors said she was finally cancer-free, I cried harder than I ever had before. I thought we'd beaten death together. I thought that kind of love was unbreakable. But a few weeks later, I came home to hear her on the phone with someone, whispering, laughing in a way she never did with me anymore. When I asked who it was, she looked at me, no emotion, no gratitude, and said, "You're not a real man." Then she packed up our children and left. That moment right there was when I realized surviving cancer was nothing compared to surviving betrayal. I didn't shout. I didn't beg her to stay. I just stood there surrounded by the quiet that follows a bomb going off, watching her fold my children's clothes into a suitcase. She moved calmly like she'd rehearsed it. I kept waiting for her to turn, to say this was a mistake, that we could talk, but she didn't. I remember the sound of the zipper closing, final, mechanical, almost cruel. The kids didn't even know what was happening. My daughter asked if Mommy was going on another trip for checkups, and my wife just smiled faintly and said, something like that. The door closed behind them, and that was it. No argument, no explanation, just absence. I sat down on the couch, the same spot where I used to sleep during her chemo when she couldn't stand me in the bed because I moved too much. I noticed the framed photo on the coffee table, us before everything, and realized she'd left it behind. I wondered if that was deliberate. That night I poured myself a glass of water, opened my laptop, and stared at her call history. The number she'd called before she said those words was saved as Dr. A, except the number wasn't from the hospital. I looked it up and my stomach turned when I saw the name. Andrew Blake. Her old college friend. The one who used to send her flowers during treatment. The one she told me meant nothing. The next morning, I went to the clinic where she'd received her final checkups. Her oncologist recognized me instantly. He'd seen me enough times to know my face. But when I asked if Andrew Blake worked there, he frowned. Andrew Blake? No, not in our system. That's when it started to sink in. All those weekend follow-ups, all those new clothes, the sudden interest in jogging, the bright lipstick. They weren't about recovery. They were about someone else. I didn't tell anyone. I just went home, opened the folder on my computer where I'd saved every medical bill, every transfer receipt, every wire I'd sent to cover her treatment, over $186,000 in total, all in my name. Every transaction tied to the house, the insurance, the loans. My name was on the debt, but her name was on the gratitude. 3 days later, a courier came to the house. A man in a cheap suit handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." It was divorce papers. Filed from her new address, a luxury apartment downtown, one I could never afford. The document listed irreconcilable differences as the reason. The words blurred as I read them. But one line stood out, printed in bold near the bottom. Primary custody to the mother. She'd already hired a lawyer. I hadn't even spoken to mine yet. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the moment I'd almost lost her to cancer, how I'd sworn to God I'd do anything to keep her alive. And I had. I'd sold my father's land, cashed out my savings, even borrowed from my brother. For years I thought I'd done the right thing. But lying there in the dark, I realized I'd only replaced one illness with another. She hadn't just survived cancer. She'd shed her old life along with it. The next morning I made coffee and checked my bank app. The joint account was empty. Not a dollar left. She'd drained it 2 days before she moved out. And then at 9:47 a.m., I got an email from my insurance company. "Your policy has been terminated at the request of the account holder." I stared at the screen for a long time, then exhaled. She hadn't just left, she'd erased me. That was the day I stopped being her savior. I became her mistake. But I also became something else. The man she underestimated. Because while she thought she'd taken everything, she'd forgotten one detail. Every cent I spent on her treatment came through my company account, not my personal one. And in my company's books, that money wasn't a gift. It was a loan. I called one person and said 3 words. "Start the clock." I didn't tell him everything, only what he needed to hear. Mark Castillo, my corporate counsel, answered on the second ring. I gave him the file name, the LLC number, and one line. They think it was a gift. It wasn't. He replied, send me everything you have, wires, invoices, promissory notes. I'll get an emergency motion drafted. That was the silent decision, one call, one trigger. From that moment on, everything I did was measured, legal, and documented. I spent the rest of the day pulling paper like a man building a case out of breath and receipts. I printed bank statements from my company account, Miller Properties LLC, showing a series of transfers to the hospital, to specialized clinics, to drug manufacturers, to a private nurse agency, 03/12/2023, $25,400 to St. Vincent Oncology, 4/23, $47,200 to Westside Infusion, 9/10/2023, $62,000 to Lumen Medical Supplies, 12/02/2023, $51,400 to private nursing services. Each transfer had a memo field, patient care, authorized by Ethan Miller, 04512. Under each transaction, I added copies of the invoices, payment authorizations signed in my handwriting, and a single line that would matter most in court. Promissory note, Miller Properties LLC to Evelyn Parker, dated 02/14/2023, $200,000, interest 3.5% PA, payable on demand. I had drafted that note the night we agreed I'd use company funds to cover the extra costs. I signed it as CEO. She signed it as recipient. It was my ace and the thing she'd thought she could ignore because it was handwritten and private. It lived in a legal binder now, with a notary stamp, and that changed everything. Mark did the rest of the work I couldn't do from my couch. By the next morning, he'd filed a verified complaint for accounting and declaratory relief in the county court, attached the promissory note, the company ledgers, the invoices, and a cover affidavit from a forensic accountant I'd retained, Sarah Flynn, CPA, who had already traced several suspicious transfers, an outgoing wire on 09/28/2024 for $40,500 to an account in Puerto Rico, an ACH to a brokerage in Manhattan for $68,000 on 10/02/2024, and multiple cash withdrawals that together totaled $5,300 in the 2 weeks before she moved out. Those withdrawals matched the dates the moving van showed up on the HOA cameras. Sarah's affidavit concluded in plain language. Transfers made from Miller Properties LLC were recorded as company loans to Ms. Parker and were not gifts. There is substantial evidence these funds were used to acquire assets inconsistent with ordinary medical or living expenses. I read that line 3 times and felt the first slow warmth of something that might be called leverage. We asked the court for immediate relief. The first filing was narrowly focused and surgical. Emergency motion for temporary restraining order and order to preserve assets, filed on 10/03/2025, asking the judge to freeze any transfers out of accounts tied to Miller Properties, LLC, or any real property conveyed by Ms. Parker since 01/2024. We also requested expedited issuance of subpoenas to banks and A-list pendants on the luxury apartment she'd rented. Mark hand-delivered copies to her lawyer that afternoon. The reaction I wanted, surprise, a slight panic, arrived in the form of a 3:12 p.m. voicemail from her counsel asking if I was attempting to bully a mother who had left an abusive household. I saved the voicemail. I transcribed it. It lived in the file too. Every hostile message would later read like an admission. While Mark handled the filings, I continued assembling the evidence kit. I downloaded my wife's call logs for the last 6 months and flagged a string of numbers. Andrew Blake's name didn't appear in hospital records, but his number showed dozens of late-night texts and calls coinciding with unexplained charges. 2 $4,500 boutique purchases, a $9,000 transfer labeled art commission, and several dinner charges at restaurants near his listed address. I pulled her emails and found calendar invites she'd sent to Dr. A, but the invite pointed to a personal email, not a clinic. There were receipts from a travel site showing one-way tickets purchased on 09/29/2025, the same day the joint account was emptied. I printed screenshots of the messages, chats where she wrote to Andrew, "It'll be easier if he comes to the hearing," and "We'll sign once the house is cleared." Those lines looked terrible on paper. They looked like collusion. I labeled a folder, Communication 06/2025, 10/2025. I put every screenshot in it. I timestamped and notarized the digital prints using an e-certification service. Small procedural steps that would stop opponents from claiming tampering. We also built a corporate route. Miller Properties LLC was not merely my name on paper. It held 2 small rental properties and the operating account through which all the treatment funds flowed. The operating agreement required any distributions above a set threshold to be approved by the board, me, my brother Paul, and 1 independent manager. The board minutes from 02/15/2023 approved loans to Evelyn specifically as interest-bearing advances. The independent manager, a retired accountant, signed off. Those minutes were public records for the company. Evelyn had signed a personal guarantee referencing them. In short, the money had been authorized, logged, and crucially recorded as debt owed to the company. If the court accepted that, then the transfers were not marital gifts but obligations. That changed the custody and divorce calculus because it recharacterized a portion of the marital estate as corporate indebtedness, not marital property to be split evenly. I won't pretend there wasn't fear. There was. The fear sat like a steady weight under everything I did, but it never spoke. The steps were clinical. That Friday, Mark filed an ex parte motion to expedite a forensic hold and to compel the banks to produce records within 48 hours. The judge signed it. Within 2 days, we had a sealed banking production showing that several wire recipients, one an LLC named Seaward Holdings, LLC, had a habit of accepting transfers, then quickly wiring them to accounts with offshore routing. Mark flagged that as potential fraud and requested a follow-up investigation. At the same time, I filed my own motion for temporary custody, attaching photos of the kids' medical appointments, their school schedules, and a sworn affidavit describing how they had been left in a doctor's waiting room the week before with no guardian listed. The court set a hearing date 2 weeks out. Outside the paperwork, I began small practical things that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with reclaiming my life. I changed passwords, I froze credit, I notified the kids' school of the pending litigation and instructed them not to release the children to anyone not on the authorized pickup list. I called my brother and told him to sit on his phone for the next 3 business days. If anything happened to the properties, he was to physically check them and video anything unusual. None of that was dramatic. It was strategy, documentation, witnesses, chain of custody. Every time I did something, I wrote it down in a log and emailed the log to Mark. Paper in lawyers' hands becomes evidence. Actions without paper become rumors. There are moments in these plans when you realize the opponent has already set pieces in motion of their own. Her attorney filed for an emergency order of his own, primary custody, expedited hearing, allegations of my harassment. I expected that. I expected the narratives. He's unstable, he's trying to intimidate, she's acting in the children's best interests. That's why every email, every receipt, every message in my file had to be airtight. The hearing would not be won by shouting. It would be won by the slow accumulation of documented facts, ledgers, promissory notes, bank records, witness affidavits, security footage, timestamps. I had to be patient and precise. Justice, I decided, would look like bookkeeping and subpoenas. It would not be poetic. It would be procedural. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not the temperature, the tone. Everything echoed. Shoes, whispers, even the ticking of the clock above the clerk's desk. When you've poured years of your life into someone, standing under fluorescent lights while lawyers speak in third person about your marriage feels like being autopsied alive. The judge's nameplate read Han R. Mitchell. He was one of those men who'd seen too much to be impressed by tears. He glanced through the stack of documents Mark had filed, then looked at Evelyn's side. Her lawyer, a smooth man in an expensive suit maybe 10 years younger than me, opened with words he'd clearly rehearsed. Your Honor, my client is the victim of financial manipulation. She endured a life-threatening illness while Mr. Miller used her condition to entangle her in debts she never understood. His tone was righteous, practiced, the kind of performance that makes you realize how far truth is from theater. Evelyn sat beside him, dressed in soft gray, hair styled neatly, the picture of calm dignity. She didn't look at me. Mark waited until the silence settled, then rose slowly. No theatrics, no speeches, just facts. Your Honor, Mr. Miller's company, Miller Properties LLC, provided funding for Ms. Parker's medical treatment under a documented promissory note signed by both parties on February 14, 2023. This is not conjecture. It's notarized, witnessed, and accompanied by ledger entries, invoices, and banking records. He handed up a thick binder. Tabbed, indexed, cross-referenced. The judge flipped through a few pages, pausing when he saw the signatures. Then he raised an eyebrow at the opposing counsel. "You're saying your client was unaware of a debt she personally signed?" The lawyer stammered something about emotional duress and implied consent. Mark stayed silent, letting the man twist. Then he added evenly, "Additionally, Your Honor, we have forensic accounting evidence that Ms. Parker transferred funds from the same LLC account to third parties not associated with her medical care, including an individual named Andrew Blake." He clicked a remote and a monitor lit up with transaction summaries. Date, amount, recipient, destination, $2,500 to a Puerto Rican account, $68,000 to a Manhattan brokerage, $15,300 cash withdrawals. Each line had a small green check mark showing verified timestamps. "We are not alleging fraud at this time," Mark said calmly, "but we are requesting asset preservation to prevent further dissipation." The judge leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at Evelyn for the first time. "Ma'am, do you wish to respond?" Her voice cracked slightly when she said, "Those were reimbursements. For expenses the insurance didn't cover." Mark's tone didn't shift. "Then perhaps Ms. Parker can provide documentation of those reimbursements." "Because we have none." He closed his binder and let the silence fill the room again. That's the thing about silence. It weighs more than any argument when the other side has paperwork and you don't. Her lawyer asked for a recess. The judge refused. "No, counsel. We've wasted enough time. Based on what I've seen, I'm granting the temporary restraining order. No assets to be transferred, sold, or encumbered until further review." He signed the order right there, pen scratching across the paper, the sound crisp and final. Evelyn exhaled sharply. Her eyes darted toward me for the first time, but there was no remorse in them. Only calculation, the kind that measures outcomes and next moves. I didn't look away. The bailiff took copies of the order, and within 30 minutes her accounts were under freeze notice. Outside the courtroom, she approached me in the hallway. The click of her heels was deliberate, like punctuation. "You think this makes you a man?" she hissed. "Dragging me through court?" I answered quietly, "I'm not dragging you anywhere. You walked out. I'm just following the trail." Her expression flickered just for a second, like she hadn't expected calm. People like her feed on reaction. Silence confuses them. She turned, muttered something to her lawyer, and walked off. I watched her disappear through the glass doors into the sunlight where reporters sometimes linger. That night, Mark called me with updates. "The freeze order's in effect." Her brokerage responded, "They've halted all trades." And Seaward Holdings was flagged for review. Good news. The forensic team believes that's a shell Andrew Blake uses for tax evasion. We might have leverage beyond this divorce. His voice was even, but I could hear a trace of satisfaction. "How far do you want to take it?" he asked. I thought about that for a while. Revenge is rarely about rage. It's about control. "As far as it needs to go," I said finally. "No farther. Just far enough that she can't hurt anyone else the way she did me." The next week, small shifts began. Her attorney filed a motion to vacate the restraining order. Denied. Then he filed for an emergency custody hearing. Continued due to lack of supporting documentation. Each denial chipped away at their confidence. Meanwhile, my side gathered quiet wins. Subpoenas to phone carriers confirming the frequency of calls to Andrew Blake's number. Hotel receipts showing overnight stays charged to her card while she was supposedly in therapy. And a statement from the clinic verifying she'd completed her last cancer follow-up 6 months earlier. Every lie folded back on itself like a map of deceit. But the real turn came through a stranger. One afternoon, a man in his late 40s showed up at my office, nervous, hands in his pockets. "Name's Greg," he said. "I used to work with Andrew. I heard about the court case." He handed me a flash drive. "You should see this." I took it, unsure if it was even real. Later, when I opened the folder, I saw scanned emails between Andrew Blake and Evelyn. Subject lines like Stage 2 fund access and wire protocols, Miller. The tone was clinical, transactional. They discussed using my corporate structure to mask transfers, moving funds through intermediaries, even referencing keeping Ethan distracted. One email read, "Once he signs off the last tax form, we can dissolve his entity and move the assets offshore. He'll think it's just accounting." I felt a coldness settle in, The kind that doesn't burn, it freezes. I sent the files to Mark immediately. By morning, he'd drafted a motion for conversion and civil fraud, attaching the emails as exhibits. It was no longer a divorce case. It was a corporate theft case with criminal implications. Evelyn's lawyer withdrew 2 days later. The new one that replaced him was quieter, older, the kind who knows when to cut losses. Through it all, I barely spoke to anyone. Friends texted. My brother called. Even my parents asked if I was okay. I told them I was fine, but the truth was I felt hollow. Winning doesn't feel like triumph when it's built from ashes, but it does bring clarity. The night before the next hearing, I walked through the apartment in silence, stopped by the framed photo she'd left behind, the one of us before all this. I didn't feel anger anymore, only distance. I slid the photo into an envelope marked evidence and sentimental exhibits. It wasn't bitterness. It was closure. The next hearing drew a small crowd. Word had spread. Someone in the clerk's office must have talked, or maybe the story just traveled the way scandal always does. Quickly, hungrily, with details twisted by gossip. The courtroom was fuller than before, the air heavy with that mix of curiosity and judgment that makes you feel both exposed and invisible at the same time. Evelyn came in first, dressed in black this time, understated but deliberate, the kind of look meant to say mourning, not guilt. Andrew Blake followed, wearing a navy suit and arrogance like cologne. He sat 2 rows behind her, pretending to scroll through his phone, but every few seconds his eyes flicked up toward me. I didn't look back. Judge Mitchell entered, expression unreadable. "We're reconvened for the matter of Miller versus Parker," he said, voice flat but firm. Mark rose. "Your Honor, since our last appearance, we have uncovered additional evidence relevant to the claims of financial misconduct." He pressed a button, and on the monitor appeared the first of Greg's emails. The room went still. The header glowed under fluorescent light. Subject line, Stage 2 Fund Access. Mark read it aloud, his voice calm, clinical. "Once he signs off the last tax form, we can dissolve his entity and move the assets offshore." Then the next, Wire Protocol, Miller. Then the third, "Keep Ethan distracted until the last transfer clears." Andrew shifted in his seat. His lawyer objected, "Unauthenticated documents." But Mark was ready. He held up a signed affidavit from Greg, notarized, time-stamped, along with metadata certification, showing the emails originated from Andrew's business domain. "Authentication established, Your Honor." The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Evelyn. "Ms. Parker, do you deny sending or receiving these messages?" She hesitated. Her hands trembled. I don't recall." "Then allow me to refresh your memory," Mark interrupted, and pulled up a photo attachment from one of the threads. Her selfie, taken during one of those therapy retreats, my same day and time stamped as the emails. She looked younger there, smiling, wineglass in hand, a beach behind her. It wasn't the image of a recovering patient. It was the image of someone celebrating. Her lawyer asked for a recess. The judge refused again. "Sit down, counselor. We're not pausing because your client's story fell apart." The next 20 minutes were a slow surgical dismantling. The forensic accountant explained the shell company, the transfers, the matching timestamps. Greg's statement described how Andrew had bragged about funding a new life with Evelyn. Using corporate money the husband doesn't even realize he's gifting us. The judge's pen stopped moving. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and said, "Counsel, this looks a lot like fraud, and a conspiracy to commit it." That's when Evelyn finally spoke, voice breaking. "He wasn't supposed to find out. He made me feel alive again." The courtroom went dead silent. Mark didn't move. He didn't have to. The judge looked down at her, disappointed, not angry. "Ms. Parker, you took advantage of a man who saved your life. You manipulated him emotionally, then financially. You used his business as your personal ATM. This isn't just betrayal, it's theft." He signed the order slowly, every stroke deliberate. "All accounts tied to Seaward Holdings, Blake Consulting, and Parker will be seized pending investigation. The court refers the matter to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Mr. Miller's petition for temporary custody is granted until further notice." I didn't smile, not even when the bailiff escorted Andrew out after he shouted something about witch hunts. I just watched Evelyn sink into her chair, pale, shaking. She looked small for the first time, like the weight of her choices had finally found her. I felt no triumph, only silence. It was the same silence I'd heard the night she left, but now it belonged to me. After the hearing, reporters gathered outside the courthouse. One of them shouted my name, asked if I had any comment. I said nothing. I just kept walking. In the parking lot, Mark caught up. "You did it," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just stopped bleeding." He nodded, understanding. "What now?" I looked at the sky, that flat gray before rain, and said, "Now I rebuild. Over the next few weeks." The news broke, local outlets, business papers, even one national headline: "Cancer survivor and partner accused of defrauding benefactor. Assets frozen pending probe." The story spread, but I stayed out of it. I spent my days working, filing reports, picking up my kids from school. They asked why Mommy wasn't home. I told them she needed time to think. They didn't need the truth yet. Children shouldn't carry the sins of their parents. One night, while sorting through boxes, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, dated months before the divorce. It was from Evelyn, handwritten, shaky. "If I don't make it through treatment, know that you gave me more time than I deserved." I never knew love like that before. I read it twice, then folded it back carefully. People change. Illness changes them faster. Maybe somewhere inside her there had been gratitude once. Before greed, before Blake, before the hunger for something newer, easier, freer. The DA's investigation moved fast. Blake was indicted within a month. Evelyn's charges were lighter: accessory, misappropriation, false statements. Her lawyer negotiated a plea: restitution, probation, supervised visitation. The same judge signed off. He didn't look at me when he said, "Mr. Miller, I hope you can find peace." I nodded. Peace wasn't the right word. Accountability was. The day the freeze order became final judgment, my company's balance sheet updated, $186,000 restored under recovered assets. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because of the number, but because of what it meant. Every cent I'd spent to save her had come back. Not as love, not as forgiveness, but as proof that I hadn't been crazy to believe in justice. I drove past her apartment once, weeks later. The blinds were closed. No laughter, no light. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The past didn't pull anymore. It just existed, like an old scar you only notice when it rains. But scars don't disappear. They remind you of the places you should never walk barefoot again. I learned that the hard way. I went home and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink behind the power lines. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger, just space. Still, there was something underneath it. An ache that didn't belong to her anymore, but to me. The kind that doesn't bleed but hums. In the following weeks, I noticed how strange life becomes after a storm ends. People treat you differently. Some out of pity, some out of respect, some out of curiosity. Old friends from college started reaching out, sending messages like, "Hey man, saw the news, glad you're holding up." Others avoided me, as if what happened might be contagious. I learned to filter which voices mattered. The real ones didn't ask for details. They just showed up, helped fix a leak in the roof, brought food, called me when my son had a fever. Quiet gestures that said, "You're not alone, even if it feels like it." But beneath the new normal, something was changing in me. Not anger, focus. I began running again in the early mornings before the city woke. The air felt like forgiveness, sharp and alive. I stopped looking at the past as a wreckage and started seeing it as raw material. I took a small loan, opened a new branch of my company, Miller Rebuild. It specialized in restoring fire-damaged houses. That irony wasn't lost on me either. People who'd lost everything hired me to make their homes whole again. I became good at that, quietly, methodically, one nail, one beam, one wall at a time. There was something healing about that kind of work. I didn't tell clients about my story, but sometimes I'd see the same hollow look in their eyes, the one I used to carry, and I'd understand without words. My kids started school again that fall. The first morning, my daughter asked if Mommy would come to her recital. I didn't lie. I said, "Maybe someday if things stay peaceful." She nodded, not satisfied but accepting. Kids have a way of forgiving before adults learn how. That night, after putting them to bed, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Family trips, birthdays, hospital visits. In one picture, Evelyn was bald from chemo, smiling. leaning into me with that fragile kind of love that looks eternal when you're in it. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. Then I deleted it. Not out of spite, but because some memories deserve to rest. A few weeks later, Mark called again. "You might want to sit down," he said. "The DA's case against Blake just escalated. Fraud, wire transfer violations, attempted tax evasion. He's facing up to 10 years. I said nothing. "And Evelyn?" I asked finally. "Probation's holding, but she's trying to petition for a reduced restitution schedule, citing financial hardship." I almost laughed. "Tell her she can keep her hardship. She earned it." He exhaled quietly. "You sure you don't want to pursue full damages? You'd win easily." I looked out the window. The kids were playing in the yard, chasing the dog, their laughter carrying through the evening air. "No," I said. "I already did." But life doesn't move on in straight lines. It curves back sometimes, testing if you're still the same person. The curve came one cold evening in November. There was a knock at the door, soft, hesitant. When I opened it, she stood there, Evelyn. She looked smaller, her hair shorter, eyes duller, skin pale. She didn't wear makeup. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a stack of envelopes. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. I didn't invite her in. I stood in the doorway, the threshold like a border I didn't plan to cross. "What do you need?" I asked. She swallowed. "It's not money. It's these." She held out the envelopes. Inside were the kids' drawings. Ones they'd made during visits with her counselor. Pictures of family colored in uneven lines. In every picture there were 3 figures, me, my daughter, my son. Never her. She looked at the drawings like they were evidence of her own disappearance. "They don't draw me anymore," she said. I didn't answer. "I just wanted you to know." I understand now. What I did. What I became. Her voice broke. "You were the real man, not him. You always were." I let the silence stay between us because it said more than words could. Finally, I said, "The kids can still love you, but it has to be earned this time. Not demanded." She nodded, tears catching in the porch light. Then she left. I didn't watch her go. That night I sat with those drawings spread on the table. Crayon lines. Smudged colors. One showed our dog, another the beach, another a house under a bright yellow sun. Simple things. But looking at them, I realized something no judge had told me. No lawyer had argued. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. You don't have to let people back in to forgive them. You just have to stop letting them live rent-free in your head. Months passed. Winter came. Evelyn's probation continued. Blake pled guilty and I rebuilt not just houses but trust with my children, with life itself. Some nights I still woke up to echoes, her voice saying, "You're not a real man." But now it didn't cut, it reminded. Because maybe being a real man isn't about saving people who destroy you. It's about knowing when to stop trying to. One morning in January, my daughter climbed into my lap and said, "Dad, you're smiling more." I laughed. "Yeah, I guess I am." "Good," she said. "Mom says that means your heart's healing." I froze for a moment, then smiled back. Maybe it is. That day I realized the story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about recovery. And recovery is quieter than revenge. It doesn't scream. It breathes. By February, the air had changed, thinner and clearer, like the world had washed itself clean after a long winter. I started driving again, not to escape, but to see. Long stretches of road outside the city where the skyline faded into hills. Old barns leaned against time, and the kind of quiet that once felt suffocating now felt like oxygen. I'd roll the windows down and let the cold slap through the car. Sometimes I caught myself smiling at nothing. Not a loud joy, just that soft, steady kind that comes when you realize you've survived yourself. Work picked up. A new contract came in for a lakeside renovation, an old 2-story cabin gutted by a storm. It was the biggest job since everything happened, and for the first time I felt hungry for the challenge instead of just grateful for the distraction. The owner, a woman named Laura, was a widow. Late 30s, practical eyes, no wedding ring. She talked about wood grain and roof pitch with the same focus I used to have before life went sideways. We worked well together. She'd stop by once a week with coffee and small talk that somehow stretched into conversations about everything. Loss, rebuilding, what you keep, what you let rot. It wasn't flirting, not yet. It was 2 people talking the same quiet language of people who'd had to start over. One afternoon she asked, "You ever get tired of rebuilding other people's homes?" I smiled. "Sometimes, but I guess rebuilding is all I know how to do." She looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's not a bad thing." There was something about the way she said it, like she wasn't talking about construction at all. I didn't think about Evelyn much anymore. But sometimes life slipped reminders under my door when I wasn't looking. One evening, after picking the kids up from school, my daughter handed me a folded note. "Mom gave this to me," she said. Inside was a small drawing. Evelyn had drawn it herself, I could tell from the soft pencil lines. It showed a house by the sea, 3 stick figures standing outside, one smaller figure at the edge looking toward the water. On the back she'd written, "Tell your dad he was right about everything. I'm trying to be better for them." I didn't know whether to feel relief or sorrow. Maybe both. I folded it carefully and put it in the same drawer as her first letter. There was no anger left, just history. The kids saw her occasionally now under supervision. They'd come home and talk about Mom's new place, a small rental near the river. "She's different," my son said once. "She listens now." I nodded. People either change or pretend long enough to make you believe they have. I hoped for their sake she'd chosen the first. Meanwhile, life didn't pause. I got the final notice from the court. Restitution complete, property division closed, custody affirmed. The clerk's signature at the bottom looked almost elegant. I stared at that paper longer than I expected. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about finality. The system that once tore me apart had now quietly sewn the edges back together. Laura called that weekend about a design choice, whether to keep the original stone fireplace or modernize it. "Keep it," I said. "It's the heart of the house." She laughed softly. "I was hoping you'd say that." When we finished talking, she paused and said, "You sound lighter." I hesitated. "Maybe I am." "Good," she said. "You deserve that." The following Sunday, I took the kids to the lake to see the nearly finished cabin. They ran across the deck, leaving footprints in sawdust. The sun broke through the clouds, hitting the water just right, turning it into liquid gold. For a moment, everything, the noise, the losses, the courtroom, even her words, felt distant, dissolved. My daughter tugged my sleeve. "Can we keep this house?" she asked. I smiled. "No, sweetheart. It's not ours. But we can build one just like it." And I meant it. That night, after putting them to bed, I walked through the quiet house. The smell of sawdust still clung to my clothes. I stopped by the mirror and studied the reflection. The lines on my face deeper now, but my eyes steady. I remembered the man who once begged a doctor to save his wife's life at any cost. The man who thought love meant sacrifice. And then I saw the man standing there now, one who understood that love without respect is just a slow kind of drowning. I whispered to my reflection, "You made it." Not proudly, just truthfully. 2 days later, I got an email from the DA's office. Case against Andrew Blake resolved. Sentenced to 7 years federal. I read it once, closed my laptop, and went to the window. Outside, the neighborhood kids were playing catch. The kind of simple scene you only notice when chaos finally stops screaming in your ears. Evelyn had testified against him in exchange for leniency. It didn't surprise me. Survival was always her instinct. But this time I didn't feel bitterness. Maybe she'd finally done something right, even if for the wrong reasons. As the weeks rolled into spring, Laura invited us to the cabin's open house. "Bring your kids," she said. "They deserve to see what they helped inspire." The day was bright, the air full of sawdust and lilacs. The finished cabin stood gleaming, its fireplace intact just as we'd decided. At the end of the event, she handed me a small wooden keychain carved with my initials. "You build homes for everyone else," she said. "Keep this one as a reminder, you can build your own too." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Sometimes words ruin moments that don't need them. That evening, driving back through the city, we passed Evelyn by accident. She was walking on the sidewalk, carrying groceries, hair tied back, face tired but calm. The kids saw her, waved. She smiled, waved back. For the first time, I didn't feel the twist in my chest that used to follow her name, just a faint gratitude for what she taught me, for what she forced me to learn, for what I could never unsee. Pain has its own curriculum. It teaches what peace can't. I dropped the kids off at home and drove for a while longer, no destination, just movement. The streetlights flickered on one by one, reflections stretching across the windshield. I thought about the last year, The courtrooms, the lies, the rebuilding, the mornings with coffee on the porch. Every piece of it had led here. Not back to who I was, but forward to who I became. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a minute with the engine off, listening to the faint hum of the city. I didn't feel alone anymore. Just present. That was enough. Maybe more than enough. The year rolled forward without ceremony, one ordinary day melting into the next. Spring pushed through the gray. The kids grew taller, and the silence in the house changed its shape. It wasn't the hollow kind anymore. It was lived in, warm. We planted a small garden behind the porch. My daughter insisted on strawberries, my son wanted sunflowers. Every morning before work, we watered them together, their small voices echoing in the yard. There was peace in those 10 minutes that court victories could never buy. Work was steady, almost too steady. I started getting referrals from clients who'd heard about the quiet guy who rebuilds homes like they matter. It made me laugh the first time I heard it, but the truth was, it did matter. I'd stopped building just to pay bills. I built to remember that even broken structures could stand again if you reinforced them from the inside out. Laura and I kept in touch. She'd call sometimes asking about wood finishes or paint colors, but I knew it wasn't really about that. We met once or twice for coffee, the kind of conversations that stretched past closing time. She was careful with words, never prying, never pitying. One night she said, "You don't look like a man who's been through hell." I smiled. "That's because I stopped living there." Her eyes softened. "Don't go back then." I promised I wouldn't. Around that time, Evelyn's therapist reached out through my lawyer. She said Evelyn had completed her restitution, maintained sobriety, and was asking to extend visitation. I agreed to supervised weekend visits, not out of obligation, but because the kids needed closure as much as I did. The first visit was awkward. She came to the park wearing a plain jacket, her hands tucked into her sleeves. The kids ran to her anyway. I watched from a distance, ready for the worst, but saw something I hadn't before. She listened when they spoke, didn't interrupt, didn't correct them. Just listened. When it was over, she approached me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For letting me try." I nodded once. "Don't make me regret it." "I won't," she said, and for the first time I almost believed her. That night I sat on the porch long after the kids had fallen asleep. The sky above the neighborhood was a dull navy, no stars visible, but the air smelled like rain. I thought about how strange redemption looked. It wasn't grand, it was mundane. It was her standing in a park, doing better in small, invisible ways no one else would ever applaud. It was me sitting here, not angry. Summer came again. The business expanded enough to hire 2 more crews. The kids spent afternoons at a nearby lake camp, coming home sunburned and loud. I bought a used pickup, the kind that rattled on highways but felt honest. Life wasn't flashy anymore, but it was real. Every bill I paid, every meal we cooked, every bedtime story, it all felt earned. Then one day, Laura stopped by unexpectedly. "The cabin's sold," she said, smiling. "I thought you should know." We stood in the doorway for a while, not saying much. "You ever think about building one for yourself?" she asked. "A real one." "Not for clients," I laughed. "Maybe when I stop fixing everyone else's." She tilted her head. "Maybe fixing others is how you'll know you're ready." We went for a walk that evening along the same road I used to drive down just to think. The air was thick with cicadas, the sky streaked with gold. For the first time in years, I wasn't watching for ghosts in my rearview mirror. But peace doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. That fall, Evelyn called. Not for money or favors, just to tell me she was moving out of state. "The kids know," she said. "I told them I'll visit when I can." Her voice was calm, almost shy. "Thank you for everything, Ethan. I hope someday they see the man you really are." I hesitated before answering. "They already do. Every morning." She was silent for a moment, then whispered, "Goodbye." The line went dead. I sat there listening to the dial tone, realizing that sometimes the last word isn't a door slam. It's a soft click that finally sets you free. Weeks later, I drove the kids out to the countryside to show them a plot of land I'd quietly bought. It wasn't big, just 2 acres near a hill and a stream. But when the wind passed through, you could hear the trees breathe. "What's this place?" my son asked. "Our beginning," I said. "We're going to build something new here. My daughter looked up at me, eyes wide. Like the lake house? Better, I said. Ours. They cheered, spinning circles in the grass, the dog chasing them. I stood there watching them and thought, maybe this is what it means to win. Not revenge, not justice, just freedom from the weight of what used to be. That night, I drafted the first blueprint on my kitchen table. Simple layout, open windows, strong beams. A house that could survive storms because it knew what they felt like. I wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. Strength isn't never falling. It's knowing how to rebuild. Construction began that following spring, slow and steady, like healing written in wood and stone. The land was rough at first. Rocks, uneven soil, overgrown weeds. But I cleared it piece by piece the way I'd cleared everything else that once felt impossible. The kids helped on weekends, hammering small nails into scrapboards, painting initials on planks I'd later use for framing. It wasn't about the house. It was about belonging again, about giving our memories a home that didn't carry the echo of anyone else's betrayal. The first structure to rise was the foundation. Simple concrete, perfectly leveled. When I poured it, I thought about all the times I'd built things for other people, families who'd move in smiling, couples who'd argue later, people who'd take what I built for granted. But this time, every square inch mattered. This was ours. No ghosts, no court orders, no apologies. Just the sound of wind through trees and the rhythm of hammers on beams. As months passed, the frame began to take shape. Every corner felt symbolic. The kitchen window faced east so morning light would fill the house. The front porch faced west so we could watch sunsets together. I carved small initials under the staircase, one for each of us, even the dog. Maybe someday the kids would find them and remember the year we rebuilt everything from scratch. Laura visited often. She never asked for explanations, just brought sandwiches and stayed to talk while I worked. Sometimes the kids joined her, laughing on the unfinished porch, chasing sawdust through sunlight. One afternoon, as I wiped sweat from my face, she said, "You ever think this house isn't just for you?" I looked at her, puzzled. She smiled softly. "Maybe it's where something new begins." I didn't answer, but she wasn't wrong. By the time the walls went up, Evelyn was just a name in the background of our story. The kids still spoke to her on holidays, and that was enough. She'd moved to Oregon, working part-time at a clinic, sending postcards every few months. Her handwriting looked steadier now. There was no resentment left between us, just distance, and distance, I learned, is another form of peace. When the roof finally sealed, I stood in the doorway one evening, light spilling through the empty frame, the air thick with the smell of pine and fresh paint. My son ran past me, shouting that his room had the best view in the world. My daughter followed, twirling in the middle of the living room, her laughter bouncing off the bare walls. And there, in that unfinished echo, I realized something. Revenge had never been the point. It was a stage, a bridge I had to cross to reach this moment. What I wanted wasn't her downfall. It was freedom from her shadow. And standing there with sawdust in my hair and the sound of my children's laughter filling the house, I finally had it. A few weeks later, the house was done. Not perfect, some corners weren't square, the floor creaked in places, but it was ours. On moving day, we slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets, staring up at the ceiling we'd built with our own hands. I remember the kids whispering stories until they fell asleep. I stayed awake, listening to the quiet. Not the kind that follows destruction, the kind that lives after it. The kind that belongs to you years past. The house weathered storms, summers, birthdays, graduations. Life found its rhythm again. One afternoon, maybe 5 years later, I was at the local market when I saw her, Evelyn. She looked older, hair streaked with gray, but there was peace in her face I'd never seen before. She noticed me, hesitated, then smiled. Not the smile that once charmed me, but a human one. Soft, tired, honest. "You look good," she said. "So do you," I replied. We stood there for a moment, strangers who used to share a life. She nodded toward the exit. "I'm glad you made it." "Me too," I said. And that was it. No apologies, no relapses, no tears. Just two people who had learned in different ways that survival sometimes means letting go before it kills you. When I got home, the kids were on the porch, arguing about something trivial. The dog barked. The garden overflowed with strawberries. I looked at the house, at the life we'd built out of ashes, and thought about everything that had led here. The chemo wards, the courtroom, the betrayal, the silence. Every piece had carved a lesson into me. That you can lose almost everything and still find yourself again. That love doesn't always return, but peace might if you give it space. I sat down on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. My daughter leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Dad, do you ever miss her?" I took a deep breath. Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. I think I just remember what we tried to be. She thought about that, nodded, and said, "You're still my hero, you know." I smiled, brushing her hair back. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just a man who learned when to stop saving the wrong person." The wind picked up, the house creaked softly, and for a second everything aligned. The past, the present, the promise of what comes next. I looked out at the trees swaying in the dusk and whispered to myself, "This is what real strength looks like." Tell me, would you have fought the same way I did, or walked away sooner?